Okay, so we are live. Um, so welcome to the first Open Knowledge Justice Program webinar. I am Cedric Lambion and I work as the Data and Innovation Manager for the Open Knowledge Foundation, and I am here with my colleague Meg.
I'm Meg Tuck. I'm Director of the Open Knowledge Justice Programme.
Fantastic. So first, some information about how it's going to work. So we are still new at all this live streaming stuff, so please forgive us if there are some missteps. But the first thing is that we do want to answer any questions that you might have at the end of this stream, meaning that we are fielding questions. You have two possibilities to ask questions. First is to use the YouTube tab. At the right side of the videos, there should be a space for you to write down questions, and we'll be looking at them and answering them. The second option is to use the OKF justice hashtag, OKF justice on Twitter, where we'll have people looking at the question as well and selecting them for answering. So there may be a need to use your Google account to connect and ask questions directly on the video. So if you're not able to do that, feel free to use Twitter and we look at both channels. So this webinar is about AI and algorithm for lawyers in the COVID-19 context and beyond. So of course, we know that some of you are not lawyers but still interested in the question of AI and algorithm. So there will be a lot of contextual elements that are useful for a broader audience. But our aim with this project, but we'll explain it a bit later, is really to equip lawyers with more knowledge and tools to tackle these emerging questions of AI and algorithm. So with that said, let's start with a little introduction. And I'd like to start with a visit to China, actually, Einstein, China. In the middle of the 3rd century before Common Era, a man called Han Fei penned a collection of essays which together form what is called the Han Feizi. This period in China is a period of transition between what we call the Warring States period and the First Chinese Empire, led by the Qin dynasty. Han Fei was a man of nobility, son to the king of the Han state, but he had one problem: he was a stutterer. In the context where the influence of your ideas were heavily dependent on your capacity to explain them clearly in front of a court, that was an issue, as you can imagine. So Han Fei, who felt that new ideas were needed to voice what was at that point the obvious decline of the Han state, focused on developing his thoughts and research in writing. The result, the Han Feizi, is one of the most important philosophical classics of science China. It greatly influenced the First Chinese Empire and still influences the country to this day. And you'll very soon see why. The Han Feizi pulls together a number of theories of government and law that belong to the school of thought called legalism. Legalism, which at the time was strongly promoted by merchants, emphasized a project of consolidating the wealth and power of the state and its ruler with the goal of achieving order, security, and stability. So these three keywords, order, security, and stability, are things that even today you will hear coming from the national media in China and the Chinese leaders. The law in this school of thought presents itself like a machine in the hands of the ruler who wields it to assert its authority. And that is possible because this concept of law is defined by three pillars: punishment, reward, and surveillance. The subjects of the states were punished if they broke the law. They were rewarded for their zeal and were expected to watch each other, extending through their actions the eye of the ruler who could see without being seen. So I think you're starting to see where I'm going here. 2 millennia later, modern China bears little resemblance to the country that it was during this period, but some things change and others stay the same. In 2009, the Chinese government announced a national experiment to develop a citizen reputation system that they call the social credit system. So I started this presentation with China not just because of its central place in the current coronavirus pandemic timeline and narrative, but also because despite the vehement denials of Western politicians, China offers a mirror to Western societies, much more than its current boogeyman status would let you believe. A distorted mirror, of course, but a mirror nonetheless. We do not need a visible central ruler to enact a system of punishment, reward, and surveillance. In the West, like in China, the visible punishments, which were avatars of the state's rule over its subjects, have gradually given way to a new modality of power, focused on a constant surveillance of citizens through the means of technology. But the state is not alone. It walks hand in hand with the corporation, which, much like the merchants of ancient China, thrives in this environment. Be during or outside times of crisis, the capitalist corporation will gently extend its invisible hand, providing star ratings as likes and likes as mean of rewards, higher insurance premiums as punishments, and smart cameras capturing everything from human faces to feather as tools of surveillance. Some may object to this framing by citing the value of freedom and, in these present times, the imperative of public health. But freedom implies accountability, which is, by all accounts, greatly lacking when it concerns modern technologies. Among those technologies currently avoiding accountability, the ones which interest us today are algorithm and artificial intelligence. Not all of them, of course. After all, an algorithm is simply a list of operations organized in a logical manner. The first formal algorithm was written by Euclid as a way to determine the greatest common divisor between two numbers. So we don't really even need a computer to write algorithm. And so that was long before the age of surveillance. And since the development of automated machines in the 20th century, algorithms have seeped into all facets of our everyday life. To operate your oven's function, to display your train number, to generate weather forecasts, to maintain the orbit of satellites overhead, or to operate the Discovery rover currently roaming on the planet Mars, but also to improve the quality of sound of this webinar, even for those of us with bad connections. So most of those algorithms do not concern us directly today. We don't really care about your oven, to be honest. They are technical tools and the exclusive or almost exclusive domain of engineers. But some algorithms have an impact on more than the technical system they are part of. Those algorithms have a material influence on society, either due to their ability to shape our relation to knowledge, such as Google's algorithm, for example, or because they have an outsized impact on our living conditions, such as a bank's loan calculation algorithm, or because they conduct or influence the operation of critical public services. For example, and that is a current example, an hospital algorithm deciding who should be prioritized when there are not enough ventilators. So those different categories of algorithm are what the Open Knowledge Foundation calls public impact algorithm. And we believe that these are the ones that legal professionals especially should know about. Before we talk about why we should all know better about those algorithms and keep them accountable, this is the opportunity for us to review a bit the structure of this presentation and also present the work, open knowledge, and the work that we do very briefly for those of you who do not know our NGO and the work that we do. So it's a simple structure. We first talk about our program, then an overview of the public impact algorithm that we've mentioned just before, and lastly, we will present a work in progress, which is a methodology for lawyers to investigate decisions by public impact algorithm. So I will let my colleague Meg present the work of open knowledge.
Thanks, Cedric. By way of brief introduction, the Open Knowledge Foundation is a global not-for-profit organization, and we're campaigning for a fair, free, and open future. We were founded in 2004, and our activities are a combination of building technical solutions to provide access to knowledge, training individuals in the skills they need to navigate data, and advocating for open, the principle that knowledge should be accessible to all. As I've already said, our team is international, and we have a vibrant network of chapters all over the world. The Open Knowledge Justice Programme was founded as algorithmic accountability became a key issue of concern over the past decade, following the emergence and spread of technologies embedding mass surveillance, biased processes, or racist outcomes into public policies, public service delivery, or commercial products. And despite a growing and diverse community of researchers and activists discussing and publishing on the topic, legal professionals across the world have access to very few resources to equip themselves in understanding algorithms and artificial intelligence, let alone enforce accountability. So it was in order to fill this gap that we created the Open Knowledge Justice Programme that aims to build the capacity of legal professionals and civic organisations to make algorithms accountable. But we're also looking to create open tools and resources to monitor and improve the use of automated decision-making in public services.
Thank you. So now let's talk about those public algorithm, and we will try to use as much as possible the COVID-19 context to also show how they impact us very much in this instance. So to start with, I'd like to start with a bit of review of the definitions. So I mentioned it briefly before. An algorithm is a series of logical steps that follows a hierarchy of importance or precedence. The most complex ones rely on the use of computers, which take data as an input. So data, and it's important to understand this definition because it then has an impact on how algorithms should be perceived. So data are structured pieces of information about the world. A coherent group of data points called a data set is necessarily the result of a choice made by someone who decided what aspect of the world was important to capture in the data set. So a data set is always an opinion. And that's very important because At Open Knowledge, we've been doing data literacy for a number of years and advising people on being wary of the risk of you taking data as at face value and not being critical in the way they appreciate the potential use and the value of data that they deal with. And this is the same for algorithm, not only because well, the fact that an algorithm has a hierarchy in terms of importance and precedence means that someone does set up that hierarchy, but also because the data that is fed into the algorithm um, is also biased in a way that may or may not be detrimental to the result being researched. So that is really important, this interplay between data and algorithm. Um, the statistical model is something that you may hear as well often enough, is where a data set is it's a representation of a dynamic process. It takes in data, um, it uses statistical methods and a number of rules that are relevant to the domain where it is being applied. And then the statistical model, outputs a prediction relevant to the process being analyzed. So the statistical model is, for example, the focus of the book of Cathy O'Neill called Weapons of Math Destruction, which I recommend reading as well, where she describes more in depth why all the different parts of a statistical model mean that there are a lot of risk implied in how they are being used. And lastly, artificial intelligence, which is another big thing. So what's really important to understand is that artificial intelligence is an umbrella term. It doesn't. There's no specific technique that is the one which bears the name artificial intelligence. It's an umbrella term for numerous techniques, which broadly have in common that the algorithm that they use have the ability to create their own rules or generate results that they were not specifically coded to produce. So this is really important because the artificial intelligence is not something that is out of this world and unnecessarily impossible to understand. It's also basically a bunch of algorithms, much more complex than the ones we used before it started developing as a research field and also a commercial field, but it's still also a number of algorithms that are being operated in different ways to reach specific results. Of course, when you're talking about algorithms that create their own rules or generate results that they were not specifically coded for, it means that you have to be much more careful about the results that it generates because you have much less control on how your algorithm work. So that's it for the definition. So what's the problem? And now I wanted to first listing a number of algorithms that have been making the news lately in the context of the health crisis and the epidemic that we're living through. So that includes pricing algorithm leading to price gouging during the pandemic. Think Amazon and mask, for example. Smart thermal cameras promoted for their AI feather detection systems. This is something that was linked, that was in an article from, I think it was the NBC, that we linked in the announcement of this webinar. Smart cameras also being sold as a way to detect if workers are too close to each other. So this is being sold for factories, but it's also true the same companies are trying to sell those cameras for use in the public space. And in the public space, we have cameras used to analyze how many people are wearing masks. This is an experiment being done in France that I learned a few days ago. And in Zimbabwe, to show that this is not only a problem of uh, developed economies, in Zimbabwe there has been an outcry because there is an opaque algorithm being used to determine the beneficiaries of the relief fund due to the um, stay-in-place orders um, that are being given to avoid overwhelming the hospital system. And lastly, and we understand we understand why I listed this one as well afterwards. Algorithms are used to prioritize access to ventilators. Um, in the resource that we're going to share after this webinar, there will be the actual reference to all these mentions, and some details about that we can't talk about right now about all those elements. So I listed some examples that are happening right now, but let's try to take a step back and understand how we can categorize algorithm and what's the different kind of issues that they bring. So from left to right, we have technical perception and projections, judgment automation, and social domain judgments and predictions. So technical perception and projection, those are basically the most technical algorithm. So for example, we will have, there are artificial intelligence algorithms that help predict if a factory machine needs maintenance. We have experiments to have artificial intelligence algorithm used to interpret MRI scans and support the decision process of the doctor. And then in banks, algorithm used to identify unusual financial flows, which is very useful because when you have so many transactions every second, you need a way to pass through all the data and select the the type of transaction that you want to zero in and investigate. So that's the technical part. And then we move into a category which is already a bit more fuzzy in terms of uh, success criteria. So hate speech detection maintenance, for example. So identifying swear words, identifying hateful references may seem like a technical job, but there's a lot of variation in how communities speak. And it has been already that some of those types of algorithm have had hiccups because, for example, in the US, the black community speaks has its own lingo and different ways of talking that was sometimes classified as hate speech. Content recommendation, for example, again, it can be seen as trivial or not very dangerous, but this is also this kind of algorithm that led to the big debate about filter bubbles on Facebook and on other platforms. And then copyright violation detection, again, are a bit controversial algorithm, even though the science behind them is sound and explainable. So moving on to the last category, we have social domain judgments and predictions. And here, this is where it becomes more icky. You algorithms that are used to identify children that should be taken by social services, or algorithms that predict or try to predict where future crimes will occur, or try to predict job candidate future performance, so used in recruitment. So all those algorithms are being applied today, and they cause a lot of issues. You may have heard of this example of Amazon developing an algorithm that was aimed at filtering through the CVs, that the resumes that they were receiving, and they ended up scrapping this algorithm because the algorithm was trying to match what Amazon thought was a good worker, a good employee, but traditionally, because of the bias in recruitment, most of those employees were white men, and so the algorithm ended up reflecting that. The question of if a child should be taken by social services is a multifaceted question with, moral dilemmas, and you have to be very careful before you decide to take a child from their family. And so um, the capacity of an algorithm to make this judgment is very much in question. And most of all, if you look at the arrow at the bottom of the slide, most of all, the problem is the level of uncertainty in success criteria. Whereas we can very much know if our algorithm that predict if machines need maintenance is good. So it's easy to identify if the algorithm is working, and the success criteria will be that we have much less breakdowns of factory machines. The question of the success criteria for taking children from their families, um, you know, on behalf of social services, is a much trickier question to answer. What is the success criteria here? And so that is um, the main problem with algorithm being used in the social domain. The success criteria is very much unclear, meaning that unless there is a clear debate about how do we want these services to operate, what should they prioritize, etc., then you have algorithms which take decisions based on values and priorities that are very much opaque to the general public, even though they affect us and the rest of citizens. But this is just one framing of the problems that algorithms pose. And we can see that when I add to this schema the algorithm that I mentioned before: AI favor detection, social distancing detection, facial mask detection, pricing algorithm, relief fund algorithm, patient prioritization. So what's interesting here is that on one hand, the question of the uncertainty of the success criteria is really an issue. But on the other hand, what we can see is that even algorithms that are part of the most technical group, such as the smart cameras, also cause a lot of problems and raise a lot of questions about their use by public authorities or even private companies, especially when they affect the general public. Because AI favor detection, on one hand, is an unproven technique. So the question is of the effectiveness of this AI algorithm, which is, despite the lack of science backing it, currently being used or currently being bought and installed by public services in the context of the epidemic. Um, but it also raises the question of what kind of other functions this AI could play. For example, facial recognition or other functions that no one agreed for, but that may use the opportunity of the installation of the smart cameras to be deployed afterwards. So even the most technical algorithm, which seem to rely on clear success criteria, being able to detect if people have masks, um, even those have raise a lot of questions about the impact on society and the level of accountability that they should be subjected to. And then, of course, when we, on top of that, raise the level of uncertainty in terms of success criteria, we also have clearer problems that appear when you have pricing algorithm that keep people from being able to buy essential supplies, then that's a problem. Um, and lastly, we have the patient prioritization algorithm. So I think this is an interesting example because it's very much relevant to the epidemic, but also because it may seem a straightforward example. For example, why do I say that patient prioritization is part of a social domain judgment category? After all, we may think that this is actually a very technical element. For example, we look at comorbidities, we look at who's more likely to survive, and we select from that. The problem is that when we when we use those criteria, for example, the number of comorbidities, the number of potential years lived after the intervention, we actually draw from a set of values that are specific to an ethical principle that they call saving the most lives. So basically, we will focus on people who we know will survive the interventions, the medical interventions, so that the most lives are saved, and on top of that, the lives that are saved are quite our lives that that are people who will live longer afterwards and not just die in the next week or year. This principle is ethical in the sense that it tries to define what is the right thing to do, but it conflicts with other ethical principles. For example, the one of redistributive justice. Redistributive justice looks not only at who is healthier when entering the hospital and consequently has the most chance to survive longer after the intervention, but also looks at how people, what relation people have the overall systems of health and care in the country. And that relation is very much linked to the social categories that you belong to, which is why we see, for example, in the US, but it is also, for example, the case in France, where certain category of population die much more from COVID-19. And that is because those categories of population have much more comorbidities, many more comorbidities. And that, in turn, is because of their poor living conditions, because basically they are poorer and they are often minorities. So, our initial ethical principle of saving the most lives end up being the ethical principle of saying mostly wealthy white people. And that's why it's a problem when you articulate it like that. And so this is why it's important to understand that there are conflicts sometimes in ethical principle. And those conflicts have to be debated, have to be compromised, but it cannot be simply the work of an obscure um, obscure committee or a private company that decides internally how the algorithm should work. It has to be a public debate, it has to be a policy debate, and this is really important. So there is a growing accountability. For example, Facebook and Google have made a lot of work to stamp out disinformation during this crisis. So that this is not just them um, being good Samaritans, but it is coming from years and years of pressure on them so that they are more responsible of the content that they manage. So that's is a reality. They are being more accountable about the impact of the algorithm. But at the same time, a growing number of algorithms are still unaccountable and unaccounted for. And there's a reason for that we can see when you take a longer view of how um, algorithms have spread in society. Um, there are three axes of this development. What I call the horizontal spread, which is basically the spread of algorithm from the margin of societies to the center. And that is very much the case for surveillance algorithm, starting with country borders, starting with prisons. They then are marketed to companies where they are installed in factories. And lastly, they start being deployed in public spaces. So at first they are where less people are looking, and more as they become more and more normalized, they um, capture more market and are being deployed in all aspects of our public life. And then there is a vertical spread as well that we need to understand. And that is very much relevant to what's happening here with all the smart cameras for detecting fever, detecting masks, etc. What's happening is that we had initially CCTV, so closed circuit TV, in the sense that those cameras didn't record much or even anything. The focus of these cameras was to record or to show a police officer or public employee um, what's happening. So they were looking at events. So if I see someone mugging another person, then I will act. That is an event. And suddenly, using this existing technology and infrastructure, um, what has been added on top are those algorithms, this smart layer. So suddenly, this network of cameras that were deployed for safety and which were deployed also under specific social contract, which is that this is not recorded. I cannot follow using CCTV um, where eh, where you live, who you are, etc., etc., unless there is a specific investigation happening. But suddenly, with facial recognition, the algorithm detects immediately who is who using police databases, etc. And the element that is recognized is not anymore the event, but the person. And this is a key change in the nature of the surveillance. And this was not done right away, but by putting together layers of technologies, each new layer building on the previous one. So that's the vertical spread. And lastly, the opportunistic spread is the two, 2008 austerity, financial crisis, the 2001 terrorist attack, the 2019 epidemic, all those shocks um, to society are used by companies to promote more and more of these algorithms and smart cameras and etc. And so a lot of those systems that are being sold and being deployed are unaccounted for, are not scientifically proven to work, are sometimes just magical thinking, but because of the panic within public offices, because of the panic among the public, no one keeps them accountable, and that is the problem that I think lawyers are very well positioned to help solve. So my colleague Meg will talk about the lawfulness of public impact algorithms.
Thanks, Cedric. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about which existing laws are relevant to the kind of harms we've been talking about that occur in AI and algorithms, and how ethics can be useful. So firstly, ethics in law's absence. No specific legislation has been passed to date to regulate AI and algorithmic public body decision making. And to some extent, governments may be adopting a wait-and-see approach, as we've seen them do before. Just like with any new technological wave, it's hard to predict just how this new technology will be used or abused, they may say. And by way of comparison, it took many years before specific laws were put in place to regulate the use of mobile phones whilst driving, for example. And lawmakers reasoned that this was because they first needed to see how the technology was being used, the hazards distracting driving created, and only then were they able to come up with meaningful laws to regulate the use of the technology. By their very nature, systems of ethics are there to fill the gaps when there isn't a normative practice as regards how to act. This was how ethics developed in the field of medicine, for example. They can be a tricky thing to use, though, because, as Cedric's already mentioned, by nature, ethics are subjective and different ethical systems may come into conflict with each other. The field of AI and algorithm ethics discussions is vast. By way of example, yesterday, Berlin-based NGO Algorithm Watch released its latest version of its AI ethics guidelines global inventory, which listed 160 and counting instances of ethical guidelines on this very topic. So how is ethics helpful to lawyers? Well, although vast, the ethics debate on these technologies is, it seems, starting to align around certain themes. And this growing consensus is likely to, firstly, influence legislators when specific laws are eventually drafted, and secondly, influence the judiciary in their interpretation of existing legal instruments in this area. And we, as Cedric has also mentioned, have created a framework for lawyers to use ethics as a starting point in building their advocacy when it comes to AI and algorithms. And Cedric will elaborate in further detail later on, but to give you an overview, the categories are, firstly, effectiveness, the degree to which the AI or algorithm is successful in producing the task for which it's being deployed. Disparate impact, the idea that a policy can be considered discriminatory if it adversely impacts a group based on that group's traits, such as race, colour, religion, or sex. Proportionality, the balance to be struck between public authority actions and interference with citizens' fundamental rights. And lastly, core values. How aligned is the technology to fundamental notions of fairness and other human values? The next slide, please. So what existing law is relevant? And which tools can offer potential solutions to these harms caused by AI and algorithms? One example, because AI and algorithms function by processing data, is obviously data protection legislation. For example, within the GDPR, Article 6 states that lawful data processing will only be so if one of the following applies: that it's necessary for a task carried out in the public interest, or processing is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interest pursued by the controller or a third party, except where such interests are overridden by the interests or fundamental rights and freedom of the data subject. We don't know yet, but successful actions utilising this provision may hinge on what the courts interpret as necessary, akin to the test of proportionality. To demonstrate this, deployers would need to show that, firstly, they've made a sufficient effort to test or investigate alternatives to a black box model, which includes non-automated system-based solutions and explainable models. Secondly, they were able to show, using a manual case review method, the thing that they did before the automated system, that the same decision would have been reached in the alternative method. This is what we call effectiveness. And thirdly, they've otherwise put in place all the checks needed to safeguard the use of this kind of automated system. For example, there could be technical checks, what we call edge case checks, logistical, for example, a staged rollout, procedural, a regular review of the algorithm's impact, and the setup of a fast and accessible complaint system, for instance. Legal, so that would be publication of the data privacy assessment, compliance against other rules and recommendations, and what we're calling political, so advertisement of the new system and public debates, for example. Articles 13 to 15 provide rights to meaningful information about the logic involved in automated decisions. And there's currently, and has been for a while, lots of debate in Europe as to the extent to which GDPR principles might be used to force organisations to disclose the contents of their black box. Although, and importantly, non-binding, Recital 71 states that safeguards for data subjects should include the right to obtain human intervention, to express his or her point of view, and to obtain an explanation of the decision reached after such assessment, and to challenge the decision. But the current position of the European Data Protection Board is that the GDPR does not go so far as to dictate that algorithms or the basis for machine learning must be completely disclosed. It's important to clarify, though, that not all algorithms use a black model. Some are clearly explainable, and they may be caught under this provision. So how useful are Articles 13 to 15? Well, as recitals are non-binding, and the right to an explanation is not mentioned in the binding articles of the text, actually having been removed during the legislative process, the indications are probably not very. In addition, there are significant restrictions on the types of automated decisions that are covered, which must be both solely based on automated processing, so they've had no human intervention, and have legal or similarly significant effects, which obviously significantly limits the range of automated systems and decisions to which these rights would apply. Domestically, as well as the GDPR, obviously the Data Protection Act 2018 is relevant here, Section 14 of which permits purely automated decisions with legal or similarly significant effects to be made about a subject in the absence of the subject's consent, so long as the subject is notified that the decision was purely automated after the fact. However, the Act is silent as to what constitutes an automated decision, stating only that they are those without any human intervention. But what constitutes human intervention? To be useful, this would need to be further qualified, we propose, to describe the quality or the extent existing quality lawyers in this area of AI and algorithm. Most prominently, the Equality Act 2010, which applies to service providers in the public sector and does provide, at least in theory, important protection against algorithmic discrimination. There is a possibility, however, that action that is prima facie discriminatory may be justified if the public authority can demonstrate the three things. Firstly, that the aim was a legitimate one. Secondly, that the action was an effective way of achieving that legitimate aim. And lastly, that it was a proportionate means of doing so. In assessing legitimate aim, in the absence of case law in this area pertaining to the specific sphere of AI and algorithms in public bodies' decision-making, the courts are highly likely to look to ethics for a steer in assessing how a public body has, or has not, as the case may be, deployed AI and algorithms lawfully. So as I've already mentioned, using equality provisions may be problematic in that in many cases it is impossible to look inside an algorithm, AI or machine learning process so as to understand and scrutinise how decisions are being made. This presents challenges obviously for the complainant in proving discrimination, for instance, in how the decision was made, and challenges also for the public authority in justifying the objectivity of that decision. So, in this evident climate of legal uncertainty and the associated evolving academic debate, we would propose that the framework of ethics not only steer legislators in forming new statutes, but also play a key role in helping tribunals interpret existing legal mechanisms for these new technological purposes. I'd like to outline just a few of what we anticipate to be future legal actions that could be taken in direct response to the COVID public impact algorithms. Firstly, an example of technology that's likely to prompt this kind of challenge, we believe, is one called the Charlson Comorbidity Index. And Cedric has mentioned already this kind of healthcare triaging system. The Charlson Comorbidity Index was deployed in Colorado in the United States to automatically determine which patients will have access not only to ventilators, but intensive care beds in the event that these resources were to become scarce, and by extension, obviously, which patients will not. The rationale for this tool is to make rationing decisions as objective as possible. It works by tallying a patient's score based on pre-existing illnesses, including kidney disease, diabetes, and HIV and AIDS. But this is an inequitable algorithm because these conditions are uniformly, as Cedric mentioned, diseases of disparity. They're a direct consequence of poverty and low access to healthcare, conditions that in the United States are marred by immense racial and ethnic disparities. Moreover, Americans of colour suffer from worse health outcomes regardless of wealth, the consequence of systematic discrimination and of a history of fraught relationships with all kinds of authorities in the US. In addition, Black Americans are 60% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes, 2.8 times as likely to have end-stage kidney disease, and 8.4 times as likely to be diagnosed with HIV than their white counterparts. So to challenge this use of an algorithm, one argument would be obviously a human rights angle. Although the algorithm is purported to be objective, by drawing attention to the disparate impact within racial groups, it can be shown to be anything but that. Using equality provisions would be viable too. The algorithm's effectiveness is clearly questionable, because if the aim of the technology is to make objective decisions, more objective than medical practitioners, about who amongst the whole population gets access to healthcare resources where provision is scant, it fails. The algorithm excludes whole swathes of US citizens from being given equal access to treatment. And although the argument would be under what we call equality legislation, what we're really talking about here is equity, in that the algorithm fails to take into account social determinants of ill health that leave Black Americans at a disadvantage even before the objective algorithm set to work. So this is anything but, as the people say, a level playing field. Now, in defence, deployers of healthcare triaging algorithm systems will argue that the technology pursues a legitimate aim in that its objective is to fairly ration healthcare in a global pandemic. And we know that preserving economic resources as a legitimate aim has been successfully argued from an employment tribunal in this jurisdiction. We will have to wait and see, but the proportionality argument is so compelling, it will be very surprising, we think, that the tribunal would not give it significant weight. So let's look at a different one. In employment law, one startup called Landing AI has created a new workplace monitoring tool that issues an alert when anyone is less than desired distance from a colleague in the context of COVID social distancing. And the company says the tool is meant to be used in work settings, such as factory floors. And one purchaser, a very notable one, is Foxconn, a huge Taiwanese manufacturer that employs over 1 million people, as well as tens of thousands of robots, making iPhones and other electronics. Now, this tool is potentially problematic because the surveillance technology can also be abused or used to normalise more harmful surveillance measures. The implementation of this tool might be the start of a slippery slope to more invasive measures for less legitimate aims. We have the idea of mission creep. And when examining the growing use of workplace surveillance, such as this, in its annual report last December, the AI Now Institute also pointed out that in most cases, workers have little power to contest the decisions of such technologies. The potential legal arguments that might be deployed here include proportionality, in that the accuracy of the system is yet unproven, and other less intrusive mass surveillance methods, or not mass surveillance methods, seem evidently feasible. In a rudimentary kind of level, for example, why couldn't an employer put markers on the floor to indicate safe positioning? So it obviously seems that there's potentially some mileage there. I'm going to pass back to Cedric, who's going to introduce our methodology.
Thank you, Meg. So as we saw, we saw that there's a number of challenges associated with the growth in usage of algorithm across society, be it public authority, private companies, and many of them are unaccounted for, many of them are still unaccountable. We saw also why, in the context of a lack of clear legal framework, there's a lot of reliance on ethical framework instead, in order to question the decisions taken by algorithm or the decision to use these these automated decision systems themselves. And there is potentially and very much possibly a close future, where all those algorithms will be challenged in court. And the point of this section is to show an approach, a methodology that we have started working on in order to equip lawyers in challenging algorithmic decisions. So the starting point of this is actually our past work on data literacy, because what we're trying to do here is algorithmic literacy. What we found is that a lot of the time, people who needed to make sense of data as part of their work didn't know where to start, especially when we were talking not simply about technical systems, but data about social systems. And talking with lawyers, talking with all kind of legal professionals in the past few months that we have started investigating the scene, a similar challenge emerged. the question is, where do I start? How do I approach um, the question of challenging algorithmic decisions? So there is obviously a basic question of compliance that does not necessarily require any kind of expertise to use. So, for example, if an algorithm, if a public authority has not um, created, not necessarily published in the UK, they don't have to publish it openly, but they have to create it, a data privacy assessment, for example. So you would do a freedom of information request, and as it appears that they are not able to provide a data privacy assessment of the algorithm. So that's a compliance, a procedural compliance issue that can lead to a decision against the use of the algorithm, at least until this compliance issue has been solved. So there are other compliance issues that can be raised, but what we are looking at here is the more subtle challenges that we may raise. So we have some whose benefits have been cut in half since the implementation of an automated decision making system to calculate benefits. So how do you challenge this decision? Where do you start to be able to find the proper legal provisions that would be relevant to this case? This is what we are trying to address. So here you can see a table that we'll go through starting from the left side, the one that is in red right now. Um, the starting point for a lawyer is the identified harm. It's the person, the association, NGO, community coming to you and saying, we have a problem related to an automated decision making system. So that's the identified harm. So the first step is consequently to properly categorize this identified harm. And here we have identified four main categories. Four, the first one is incorrect decision. So incorrect decision is um, the algorithm has made a decision that is clearly wrong on its face or that is probably wrong. So, for example, it has cut my benefits in half when nothing has changed in my status. Okay, that is different from the disparate impact, which is basically um, incorrect decision that is systematic and that applies to a group of people because of a characteristic or a number of characteristics that they share. So, incorrect decision is when the decision is problematic but essentially random to some extent as to who is impacted, whereas disparate impact is where there is clearly a pattern in terms of the groups which are negatively affected by the decision. Then you have the question of relative performance, which is basically what we mean here is that when you believe that the infringement of your right that is caused by the algorithm or the smart system is not necessary to achieve the result that it purports to achieve. So, for example, the question of identify using a smart camera to identify if employees are doing proper social distancing can be questioned because a system that would be an analog system of putting markers on the floor of the factory, for example, could be as performant without infringing the rights of the workers on their job. So that's the relative performance between solutions. And then lastly, the identifying harm could be a breach of core values, and often the value that comes up during debates around the use of algorithm are related to dignity. So that is most commonly uh, used as an example of the value that can be um, harmed by the use of automated decision-making systems. So that's the harm identification part. Then you have then starting from there, it becomes much easier to um, match them, to link them to our ethics framework. And here we have the different categories that Meg mentioned earlier. And again, why we going through the ethics framework? It's because there is no clear normative environment, as in legal framework, that allow us to clearly decide if an algorithmic decision was correct or not. This is still part of the public debate, and it is very much clear and expected that the current discussions around ethical principles around algorithm will influence the actual laws that will be voted later on. But um, as of now, the our ethics framework is the best way to approach the question, um, to then identify which laws are relevant. So I've identified my harm, for example, and so if I know that the problem is an incorrect decision, then the question is of effectiveness. Okay, so we have a solution that is being used, but it is not effective, or its effectiveness has not been proven. Or the question may be of social impact because minorities are more impacted than others, negatively impacted. The question could be of proportionality, um, when a solution that could be more explainable, or that could avoid breaching um, core rights or values, could be used instead of the one being used. And interestingly, it's not simply about for example, we may think that public authority being ignorant of um, what works and what doesn't, just take what is being promoted to them. But the reality is that even within the scientific field, there are some criticism about how too many scientific teams or research teams go first for black box algorithms, so unexplainable systems, instead of first trying to see if the question that they're trying to solve could be solved by more explainable systems, such as systems based on regression analysis and this kind of statistical techniques. And lastly, identifying the 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 harm created by the algorithm through the lens of our core values. So this is the ethics framework which then help us identify which indicators we should be looking at. The indicators here are what lawyers call evidence. So that is the evidence that we will bring to court to argue our case. It's not just enough to say that well, there is a clear problem of disparate impact, as there is a clear problem of proportionality. Um, you have to show clearly where, how, and why. And this part is important because it may feel like investigating algorithm require necessarily technical background, a strong knowledge of how algorithms work. But the reality is that in a lot of ways, the challenging algorithmic decisions does not necessarily require digging into the code of the algorithm. Um, Ideally, it would it would be possible to understand all the time how the algorithm make its decision. So the priorities that embeds in its decision process. But knowing the priorities and the logic of the algorithm does not mean that you should be able to read the actual code of the algorithm, although knowing the code may lead to situation where you identify bugs in the code, which are basically also another piece of evidence of problematic implementation. But this is not necessary. And in the case, for example, of effectiveness, um, we can look at the data that the algorithm is being fed to identify potential issues in the effectiveness. For example, if the algorithm takes into account less data than a caseworker, for example, would take, it may lead to a decision that uh, seem on their face absurd for the person impacted by the algorithm, but that are logic for the algorithm itself. And another aspect of it would be the bad design of the algorithm. So we said that algorithms are basically rules arranged according to a specific logic and specific priorities. Then in these rules, there may be flaws in the design, flaws in the thinking behind the rules, and this is where also that we could be looking at. And again, for a lawyer to understand the rules of an algorithm does not require them to look at the code, but that can be either because the algorithm is explainable. So, for example, there is a category of algorithm where it's basically um, a yes and no system. For example, are you over 50 or under 50? Are you single or are you married? Do you have children or do you not? So this kind of rule system can be understood by a lawyer and can be analyzed without any technical knowledge in order to identify why an algorithm creates incorrect decisions. Um, other other algorithm, especially AI-based systems, will be uh, almost impossible to investigate, at least at based on the current state of the research. And this is where this becomes much tricky, and where you may rely more on identification of the impact of the decisions rather than the logic of the decision. Um, so disparate impact will lead you to investigate the data as well, the design, but also possible ethical principles. So that brings us back to our example of the triaging system, where saving most lives conflicts with redistributive justice. Um, Really, proportionality is often identified by the fact that the organization or the authority that has deployed the algorithm has not formally evaluated this solution against others that may infringe less rights, that may be less problematic. And lastly, the breach of core values, an algorithm, for example, that decides that your child should be removed from your family, or that you should only have um, a certain amount of money for your public benefit, but that amount is lower than what you need to be able to live decently. So that's a problem in those are two examples of decisions that are linked to the concept of dignity. And here, everything should be investigated. But one of the things that a lawyer can also ask is, for example, an edge case check. So an edge case check, for example, will be to identify if um, if there are people concerned by the decisions of the algorithm whose um, whose decision whose if the decision taken by the algorithm for those people is very different from the decision that the algorithm usually take for people of similar profile. So, for example, looking at public benefits, we would look at the average of change in public benefit calculation before and after the implementation of the algorithms, and this this will allow us to identify people who are very far from the average of change. So all this process, all this evidence can be gathered by a lawyer which understands, of course, how algorithm work, but um, with an understanding of how they work, but with not necessarily um, with a technical background. That said, it may require to call on experts to do more comprehensive audits of algorithm. But what we want to stress is that this is not um, necessary for all cases or even for most cases. And lastly, to give an example to illustrate this with public law, um, you would link the would link this basically pipeline from identifying harm to ethics framework to indicators to the relevant legal provisions that would help you argue this case in court. So an incorrect decision, the question of accuracy and effectiveness would be relevant for a judicial review, which is the term used in the UK. Um, Mobilizing the Discrimination Act would be possible if you are able to measure disparate impact. Proportionality is also a relevant criteria. Lack of proportionality is a relevant criteria for judicial review, and non-respect of core value can be argued at the European level, for example. So that was the presentation of our five-step methodology for lawyers to challenge algorithmic decision making. And we believe that this is accessible for most lawyers which who have interest in those kind of cases, and for the most part do not require any kind of reliance on an expert in software development or algorithm design or any kind of other case. It may be interesting to for them to inform your thinking as always, but they are not necessarily the ones, the only ones that can help clarify these cases. So categorize the case, map the identified harm to the ethics framework, identify the relevant indicators, and match the identified issues to the relevant legal provisions. And the fifth step, of course, is by strengthen findings with contextual evidence, showing, for example, that um, the the organization has not done a proper comparison between potential solutions would be a contextual evidence. In the UK, there is no law mandating that public authority have to compare to fund time and use time and funding to compare different solutions before implementing them. But that can be used as contextual evidence that they did not take the proper steps to check the potential harm created by their automated decision-making system. So that's it for the core of this presentation. The last thing that we wanted to share is that this project will continue scaling its efforts. We had some initial trainings planned, but with the current health crisis, it will be delayed to the fall or later. But we still plan to organize additional trainings for legal professionals. We plan to create resources to support transparency and accountability within public bodies, such as procurement questionnaires, to avoid algorithm systems being bought without a critical review of their uses and implementation, and more research to better understand the landscape of algorithm use, especially across public services, but not only, because we are concerned with a public impact algorithm, which can be used by banks and used by big technological platform, as long as they have a broad impact on society and citizens. So that is what we wanted to share. And if you have any question, we would be happy to answer them. Do you want to add something, Meg?
No, we've got nothing on the Twitter, no.
No, not on Twitter.
No.
Michael mentioned that he was quite disappointed by the Data Protection Act of 2018. No framework for data processing by government ever resulted.
Yeah, I'd agree, Michael.
So what we going to do next for the people who have registered, but also for the people who have subscribed to our newsletter on our website, we will send a document summarizing. We will send a presentation, a longer document summarizing the resources that we've drawn from to build this presentation. And we will keep you updated about the upcoming trainings. We may organize online trainings as well, to have those trainings happen even in the current context. And we plan as well to publish a number of articles in the upcoming weeks and months addressing the question of public impact algorithm from different angles. So thank you for joining us. We are at the end of this webinar, and it was a pleasure for us to be there and to present the state of our research and work, and we hope to be able to share more in the future as we keep doing our research and as we keep interacting with lawyers, but also NGOs, public authorities, etc.